While circles and ellipses are very difficult to draw because they're round, there are certain steps we can take to help us constructing them correctly. So let's take a look at a circle first. What we have to do in step 1 is create a proportional square. It really has to be even, otherwise it will not work. Then we can draw from corner to corner a diagonal. Because of this, we actually can find the midpoint of our face. And with this midpoint, now we can actually draw a line up and a line down, left and right. And we found the midpoints on these edges. That's actually quite important. And the main reason for that is we can now construct actually our circle. So I will use the ellipse template or circle template, position it at the center, and then I will scale the circle down. And you will see that the circle perfectly runs through each midpoint. So let's sketch this one in. And there. And there is now another element I would like you to pay attention to, and that is where the blue line cuts actually those diagonals. Now these are actually at a 1/3 position of one diagonal part. So there's number 1, and properly here would be the other 2/3 points. If we would take a rectangle and start drawing from there, we can draw a rectangle to the other side, and you will see that a smaller rectangle can fit into there. So that's kind of like the way how we can easily construct a circle. Basically what we need to find is the midpoints on those outer edges, and then we need to find the midpoints, the 1/3 points on the diagonals. There's another element to a circle, but particularly to an ellipse I would like to introduce you to. So let's create an ellipse. And let's draw a line through the center down to there. You see, this green line defines the shortest width of an ellipse, and that's actually called the minor axis. Then we also have this line. Let's rotate this one correctly. There. From here to here, we call this one the major axis because it defines the biggest or the longest width, and the minor axis defines the shortest distance. And for new students, sometimes to better understand which one is which one, there's another very simple trick how we could memorize it. So I will just move this ellipse down, and let's just create the missing lines there and there. So for example, a quick line down there and a quick line. So you see this is actually now a cylinder, and you see that the green line actually runs through the center in the moment and actually goes down to the other disk. So think about minor axes as kind of like the axis that connects two wheels of a car, and the major axis is basically defining the diameter of a wheel, because an ellipse is actually a circle, but in perspective view the circle will be scaled down to the shape of an ellipse based on how far we see it from the front and how far we would see the circle from kind of like this side. Having this covered, let's go ahead and try to draw an ellipse in perspective view. So I will create myself quickly a proportional rectangle. And again, if you want to create a wheel in perspective, the square we will create has to be really a proportional square. It can't be a scaled or stretched version. So try to kind of like create something that feels like a proportional square. Maybe like this. Let's see. Okay, good. So I mentioned what we have to do first is create the diagonals there. Number 1 and number 2. Because with the diagonals we actually can find the midpoint, and where these two cut we actually know the midpoint on these edges. I already have the midpoints on the vertical edges because this square is actually 50-50 above and below the horizon line. Okay, good. So let's actually pull out our ellipse tool. Let's rotate it. And try to see how good maybe my rectangle was. And it looks like, yeah, I can squeeze it in there. And you see, actually, if you pay attention to where my ellipse touches the bounding box, you see here, there it touches it, there it touches it, here and here. And then there's the rest of our ellipse. So what we established in the previous video, or not video, little clip, that the ellipse runs through the midpoints. Here's the proof of it. That's actually very true. Also, another thing I would like to point out, this rectangle, as I mentioned before, is 50-50 above and below the horizon line, so it's centered on it. You see that the circle actually is vertical. Keep that in mind for the moment because that's going to be important for the next step. Okay, so let's do this one more time. This time we will create a rectangle that is directly below our object. So maybe there, let's say, we'll make this a tick bigger. There. Okay, so from there to there and there. So this will be kind of like a 1-point perspective rectangle. There, and now we have to judge quickly the distance. And I think maybe this might be it. Okay, then the same jazz. Diagonals. Actually, in this case, I only need one diagonal because now I found actually where they intersect because of this midline there. So there is my midline. And now I can bring down my ellipse tool. Let's rotate this one back to 180 and try to see how we can squeeze this one in. Close a little bit more there, and there you see it again. It touches exactly on these corner points there. Okay, so let me here zoom in a little bit because I would like to show you another trick with these 1/3 points. You see, this is a smaller rectangle and this is a bigger rectangle. So I would not try to judge the 1/3 point on the smaller rectangle, diagonal, because the smaller line is, the bigger the impact of a mismeasurement will be. If we actually guess the 1/3 point here and we're a little bit off, it's not going to impact your drawing as much. So because this right now is actually a 1-point perspective view, I can draw a line simply this way, there. Okay, I have to insert my other diagonal as well. You see it cuts it there and there. And the main reason for this is now you see I start my guideline there and go to the vanishing point, and you see from here I can draw a line and it touches the other diagonal. And then where the other diagonal is being cut by this line there, I can draw another line over. And again, because it's one point, this line can be horizontal. And then from the vanishing point through this point, to double check that you constructed the rectangle the correct way, the line later has to stop where we started. And it did. So I do not actually judge these 1/3 each one individually. I try to use one line that is very, very easy to use to judge the 1/3 point, and then I will construct the smaller rectangle by in one point all lines are horizontal, so that's easy, and then the other lines go to the vanishing point, and later you will see in 2-point perspective is basically all vertical lines are just straight down, and then the other lines go to the left or the right vanishing point. Okay. So let's try this one out on a square that is not perfectly centered. You will see that the lower part is a little bit more below the horizon line. Okay, so you see I have my original rectangle created. To create this proportional rectangle, as you can see, I used actually a 45-45 grid or square and just only drafted up one side. So now I will find actually my diagonal line and go to here, and let's find where the other line is. There it touches it. Okay, you see I do not draw the complete diagonal lines, I only draw the lines I need, and just I mark some points there on the edges. Ooh, that wasn't enough. Okay, a little bit pressure. Try to get into the habit of just marking some specific locations with small lines. That will be sufficient. You don't necessarily have to draw everything. So let's take a look. Yeah, okay, good, perfect. So now I have actually the midpoints there and there, and that actually works. So I need to find somewhere where my 1/3 points will be. So from the corner points I will draw some lines in. Okay, so here we have a line, and I mentioned before, try to work with this one. There's one simple trick now how we could maybe find actually the 1/3 position a little bit easier. You will see I position the guide from one midpoint to the other midpoint because I can actually then connect these two edges and draw a diagonal, and it cuts the other diagonal. See here, this is now a smaller rectangle, and this is like the midpoint. So this helps me to understand if this is a midpoint, somewhere here would be a quarter, so maybe the 1/3 would be here, and maybe the next 1/3 would be here, and then the third 1/3 will be smaller because it's foreshortening, so bigger, smaller, even smaller. Okay, so mentioned before, now in vertically I can draw this rectangle, and from there to the vanishing point I can draw this rectangle, and then from there to there I can draw this rectangle, and then there it's going to be just a vertical line because we're in 2-point perspective. If everything is done right, this line has to touch the other edge, and it does. Okay, so let's see if actually my 1/3 gas is okay. So to draw now in perspective an ellipse, best is actually to mark these points. So that's where you have to draw, and then you move your hand and ghost over it. Try actually not to draw one arc and then draw the next arc and the next arc, because afterwards your drawing might superimposed look like this. You want to have a nice movement, ghost over it, and you will put some lines down, and then at one point, if it looks good, a little bit more pressure. Okay, let me undo those lines. And let's bring in my ellipse template. Because with the ellipse template, I can perfectly demonstrate to you how minor and major axes work. And you will see that the ellipse now, unlike the previous ellipse we created, will be rotated. So I will make this a little bit bigger and there, and here I have my rotate tool. And you see when I rotate it, there is actually kind of like a dashed line. That's the minor axis. You see how this gets smaller? There. So the minor axis is the smallest distance. So now I can position this one in there and try to figure out, oh, wrong rectangle, this bigger rectangle. There, maybe a little bit bigger, smaller from there, maybe a little bit up, and there. So where's the rotate tool? It's there. So if I start moving this one, the dashed line ideally should run through there. It's close. So let's bring this one down a little bit. Yeah, I see. Close there. Yeah. So this is good enough. Let's actually sketch the ellipse. You also see it runs through here and runs through there. Well, my first 1/3 point is actually off, but interestingly the next and there, they're close. And this is actually a pretty small drawing, so probably because I'm off here a little bit with some lines, you will see that that small inaccuracy already resulted maybe in some of my drawings to be more inaccurate. Another reason why I try to always draw big, because then smaller mistakes won't jump as much at you. So, and that's basically what you have to look for if you create an ellipse at a face that is not directly below the center vanishing point, or is not perfectly positioned on the horizon line, so facing the left or the right vanishing point. Your ellipse has to be rotated. So again, if I turn this one on, you see kind of like the minor axis, and here is actually the center of my ellipse. So let me show you the position of minor and major axes. So this one I will draw to there. So think about now what I mentioned with car axis. So here's our minor axis, and this one now has to be at best perpendicular to this line, so kind of maybe there. So that's our major axis. And because this is actually an ellipse tool, what has to happen is along the minor axis, you should be able to fold over actually the ellipse. So the lower part has to be equal the upper part. If that is the case, then actually your ellipse is correct. If you have the feeling that these two halves are very different, then probably the square is actually not proportional. So you can't actually construct a circle ellipse in perspective into a square that in perspective is not really a proportional square. So here we have a second square. This time I'm pushing that square down to the cone of vision. So we have a different proportion. So let's do the same again. I will actually draw my diagonals, and then their other diagonal. Then I can find the midpoint there and there, and I can find the midpoint on the two vertical edges. Okay, good. Just to help myself here again, I will draw this one line, and then maybe go to here, draw this one down there and there. So there's my midpoint. So 1/3 maybe might be here. Okay, and let's try to draw this one, and let's hope it will be better this case. And don't be too picky about this thing. Ideally, at one point you will develop a certain feeling for how the ellipse has to go. This is the reason why you ghost actually more into the ellipse, but really you have to hit those midpoints, and then the 1/3 mark is more or less kind of like a small helper for yourself. But the really important part is actually the position on the midpoints. Oh, interesting, actually overlaps there. Huh. Okay, good. So there's my inner rectangle. Okay, so let's go to the ellipse tool and switch to blue, and let's try to scale this one in. Now this one again has to go to that other vanishing point there, maybe a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller. There. Okay, so that worked out good. And let's click on the rotate. Yeah, not 100%. Well, it's a little bit inaccurate. But there's now that ellipse. Now if we compare this actually with the previous ellipse, there you can see that this is not rotated much, and this is actually rotated a lot. And let's see, where's that other one? There, this is not rotated at all. So you see, the further it goes down, the more it will rotate. So here I created the rectangle in the back, and I would like to show you how the ellipse there actually will look like in comparison to the first ellipse. So let's pull up the ellipse template. You see I rotate that slightly into the correct position, and a little tip, I can actually nearly force an ellipse in there like this. This might look correct, when again you see where my minor axis points to, this is way too off, so try to always make sure this is more or less like this. Okay, so here, let's see, there, okay, good. And let's draw this ellipse in, and let's take a look at our other ellipse. So you see this ellipse is kind of smaller, feels more squeezed, because also pay attention to how, maybe let me draw actually over these rectangles, how these rectangles are different from each other. So here, let me draw this one red. There, okay. And straight down, straight down. And let's use green for the back one there. Because if, like the front, the red rectangle, we don't really see much of its face, because at one point we would look maybe perpendicular, or no, tangent on it. the ellipse that's on it, so the circle, will look more squeezed. And with the green rectangle, because this is further away from our eye, we actually see it a little bit more from a perpendicular position than tangent from the red one. We see a bigger surface, and thus actually the circle or ellipse on that square will also look bigger. So that's quite normal if you have the feeling that these two ellipses are not really the same, because they aren't. And now we can actually maybe draw in some boundary lines. So you see this midpoint and midpoint, they touch. So that's correct. That's correct. Here we have to put down a line. Oh, something is incorrect here. This edge should be there. So one thing is maybe off here, but this is only the edge you will see. Like this edge up here, that's actually a contour edge, so let's make this thicker. And then these other lines here, they're more on the object, so we can draw them with a little bit of pen pressure, not too much. Okay. And in case you really have the feeling that the ellipses are too wrong, maybe actually you can see that the rotation is totally off, then probably what happened is that these two squares you put the ellipses on are not proportionally the same, meaning they have different formats, and that will actually result in the circle we project onto it, or ellipse, to be distorted. So always make sure, that's the reason why I stress it, make sure that your cube you work in is really correct, because if that is not correct, everything you will do afterwards, specifically with ellipses, will fall apart and immediately be wrong, and there's no way to fix it. So just to summarize, if you feel the ellipses are really off, check your construction squares if they are actually maybe off, and if one is off, maybe just correct it a little bit and then sketch over it. And some steps back, I mentioned that I would never draw from one point through the midpoint to the end point and construct an arc this way, and then even trying to do this 4 times to create a circle. I would always move my hand over the square ghost and then draw it all at once. But I didn't necessarily explain why you shouldn't do that. So let me put up the template for the circle, and you can easily see that the circle comes up on a curve, touches the point, and then continues as a curve going away from the surface. Here as a curve, it comes to the surface, touches it, and goes as a curve away. And that is very difficult to do by hand, because essentially we tend to very often, let's say, draw more straight to there, and if I come from the top, I draw straight more to there. I try to hit this point and then I end there, which is why sometimes our arcs then actually will look like maybe this, or from the bottom up there. And you see, actually, if I continue this one, this goes maybe there, and this one goes maybe there. So the arc and the bending after this point is incorrect, which is why it is a lot easier to draw big ghost, because never start at a point and end at a point. Come actually and flow through the point, draw through the last point, continue, and then you release pressure and your line on the paper will fade out. So that ideally it might actually kind of like more look like something like this. Or from the other side there. It's easier for me to draw to the left than from the left up. And you see here what's important is this is arced, this is arced. So these areas will look much better. Also keep in mind, ellipses are incredibly difficult to draw, but you still have to practice drawing them as accurate as possible. But for final presentation, then we would actually take ellipse templates and clean them up.